just a little bit of background as to how this talk came about. As Sally mentioned, most of my field work tends to focus in County Clare, although I do work elsewhere around the island. But this particular interest came about because it's what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is a chapter really that's coming out quite soon in a volume called Sligo History and Society. And that's a whole series, county by county, that Geography Publications puts out. The editors, William Nolan and Kieran O'Connor, one of my colleagues in NUI Galway, is another one of the editors. So they asked me to look specifically at County Sligo and look at this roughly millennium between about 2500 and 1500 BC. And basically try to, pick out some interesting aspects of that and write the chapter for this volume, which will, the volume when it comes out will cover it has a very strong geographical and historical focus, but everything from earliest archaeology right up through to recent history. So that's how this came about. So some of you will, so this isn't a, some of you will see there will be some omissions. I'm not going to talk about every site in Sligo that dates to this period. And then there'll also be other sites that I will include that you might already be very familiar with. But I've picked and choose various sites that I have found particularly interesting. And you'll see that the themes I'll try to bring out tonight are people. I'll try to actually, kind of bring some of these prehistoric individuals into a bit better focus, and then power. And by that, it'll become more apparent as I talk. But as Sally said in the introduction, a lot of what I'm interested in archaeology is social dynamics. How do societies organize themselves? How do leaders come about? What kind of power tensions are there within societies and between societies? And I think in this period, in Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age Sligo, we can pick some of that out. Okay. Oh, so I should say actually that there's two different ways of pronouncing Chalcolithic, either Chalcolithic or Chalcolithic. Most Irish say Chalcolithic. Myself being an American, I say Chalcolithic. So you'll just have to get used to that. Okay. So the first thing I want to start with then. Oh yeah, wrong button. Okay, when we're right at the beginning of the Chalcolithic, which as Sally mentioned is a very first use of metal. So the chalco bit just refers to copper and lithic stone. So it's kind of the copper stone age. And gold is also in use at this time, but it's a very early use of metal. One of the biggest things happening in Europe at this time is something known as the Beaker Phenomenon. So that's what I'm showing you on this slide. And the Beaker Phenomenon is a widespread phenomenon, mostly in Western Europe, and that map is showing you those kind of highlighted areas of where it is most intense, down in the Tagus estuary, down in modern-day Portugal near Lisbon, up in the Low Countries in the lower Rhine area, in Brittany along the Atlantic coast there. And what all those red arrows are showing you is that one important aspect of the Beaker Phenomenon is the linking up these widespread exchange networks that start linking up these disparate parts of Western Europe at this time. And what do we find on the ground then? Why is it called the Beaker Phenomenon? Well, it's named after these distinctive vessels that you can see a couple there from Britain up there that are these kind of S-shaped profiles, and they have these horizontal bands of decoration, and they hold about a liter, the typical ones that you see there. And they're generally interpreted as drinking vessels. But there are also related food eating and food serving vessels. You see some from Iberia down there, from Spain down there. And in general, beakers and these other sets like you see from Iberia seem to be associated with social drinking and hosting of probably not massive feasts, but of small scale feasting events. I'll show you some examples later, though. We have evidence of quite massive events. But also associated with beakers are not just these eating and drinking vessels, but daggers. And they're showing you some early copper daggers and a stone dagger as well. Wrist guards, which we'll talk more about, which are part of an archer's equipment. So this whole identity of the warrior armed with a dagger and a bow and arrow, because those wrist guards are part of an archer's equipment to protect the wrist against the snap of a bowstring. And you can see on the one kind of in the middle there, I've shown some arrowheads too, these distinctive barbed and tanged arrowheads that are characteristic of this Beaker period. So we start to see in the Beaker period particular social identities coming to the fore. I'll expand on this more, but one of the primary ones, and you can see it on this slide, are warriors. So how does this affect Sligo? Well, the place to start talking about the Beaker phenomena in Ireland is the Moytira wedge tomb, which is sited on the high ground east of Lough Arrow. And Moytira is important not only in Sligo in terms of the Beaker phenomenon, but in Ireland as a whole, because it's the very first place that Beaker pottery, this widespread, Western European type of pottery, was discovered in Ireland. So the wedge tomb was excavated. Several inhumations were found, that is, several individuals not cremated. I'll show you in a minute. So a few broken beakers and a long thin piece of bronze and copper. So yeah, so here are the Moytira beakers. And the form and the decoration of these particular beakers from the wedge tombs places them early in the Irish sequence. So they're probably anywhere from about 2450 to 2200. So that's early in the chronology of Irish beakers. And that's significant because what it shows is that all the way out on the west coast of Sligo, right at the start when the Beaker phenomenon reaches Ireland, Sligo is in contact with these far-flung regions. And not only that, but again, the form and the decoration on the Moytira beakers suggests probably that this early influence is coming up an Atlantic axis, so up the Atlantic coast. Because when beakers themselves, beaker-related artifacts, the whole Beaker phenomenon reaches Ireland, there's really two axes where it comes in. One is really Northern Europe across Scotland and into Northern Ireland that way. And the other axis is from Iberia, Western France, and up an Atlantic axis that way. So, and probably both those routes eventually reach Sligo, but so far from what we have, it's that Atlantic connection route that seems to be the earliest in Sligo. So Moytira is a wedge tomb. So a little bit about wedge tombs. This is showing you the distribution of wedge tombs right across the country. So wedge tombs are these small, quite simple little megaliths, showing you various examples. Those aren't Sligo examples there. I just pulled some from my computer. I think the top one is Cork, the middle one's Inishmore out on the Aran Islands, and the bottom one's one on the Burren down in Clare. But that's what the Sligo ones look like as well. These little wedge-shaped boxes, wider and higher at the front, lower and narrower at the back, hence their name. Where they, so yeah, you can see there's a fair amount of them in Sligo. The real concentrations are down in Clare and Kerry and West as well. When they're excavated, some don't have a lot of them. Others, like Moytira, do have multiple inhumations. So they do seem to be ritual burial monuments, and not just for a single individual, but you were still getting multiple burials in them. Now, a very interesting thing about wedge tombs is that they're, in terms of Irish megaliths, they're very late. They're the latest Irish megalith that comes about, and they are actually contemporary with beakers. But not all wedge tombs have beakers in them, like Moytira, but they do seem to be contemporary. And that's quite interesting, because if we look at this slide, and I've just shown fairly schematically here a chronology of Irish megaliths. So the things like portal tombs, court tombs, simple passage tombs, those are all at the very beginning of the sequence, and actually built at the beginning of the Neolithic, just shortly after 4000 BC. Then the big mega passage tombs, like the Bend of the Boyne, I've got a picture of Newgrange there, but some of the massive ones you have in Sligo as well, seem to be later in the centuries around 3000 BC. And then wedge tombs, and there's a big gap there where no megaliths are built. And then wedge tombs are built probably starting shortly after 2500 BC, and then going on for a few centuries. So the question I posed there, a very interesting question, is why was there this reemergence of megalith building after so many centuries of Irish people not building megaliths? And one of the things that's quite interesting, if we look to anthropologically at societies that build big funerary monuments, what might they have in common, or what might the social context be, why people invest so much time and labor in these sorts of monuments? And one commonality that comes out of those anthropological studies is that often societies that invest these large amounts of labor in these huge monuments, often with a funerary element, are societies where statuses are in flux. In other words, people are competing for social status. People are competing for power. And some of that competition is played out in building these funerary monuments. So if you look again at that diagram, what's going on shortly after 4000 BC in Ireland? Well, that's the start of the Neolithic. New waves of people are coming into Ireland. The population is rising beyond levels that way beyond Ireland has ever seen before. People are clearing the forests. They're starting to farm. All those things would be an ideal situation for societies where power and status is in flux, and you have different groups or lineages competing for power. And I think that's probably the context in which those early megaliths are being built. Something else is happening around 3000 BC, but that's the subject for another talk, not this one. What's going on in terms of wedge tombs? Well, the Beaker phenomenon. I mentioned this is a period when Ireland is starting to connect to widespread areas. Ancient DNA analysis in other parts of the Beaker phenomenon has shown that there is a considerable movement of people at this time. We don't have a lot of ancient DNA for this period in Ireland yet, but certainly people are moving around, and new technologies are coming in. Metal is coming in. The first metal miners in Ireland down in Kerry in Ross Island are using Beaker pottery. So new technologies are coming in, probably new people. Long distance exchange networks are opening up. All these things are things that would be disruptive to societies. And again, it's probably that context of competition and people competing for status and power that I think that probably wedge tombs are built in that kind of a social context. Okay, so then where are wedge tombs in Sligo? And that, again, is quite interesting. So in the upper left there, I've shown you the distribution of passage tombs in Sligo, and in the bottom right, wedge tombs. And you can see, in fact, that the distributions are quite different. So for instance, the great Neolithic passage tomb cemeteries of Carrowmore and Carrowkeel are down that spine where the N4 runs today. There's not too many wedge tombs in that area. In fact, you'll see there's a reasonable amount of wedge tombs up in North County Sligo, where there really aren't many passage tombs. And there's a good number of wedge tombs out in the far west of County Sligo, where again, passage tombs are pretty few and far between. So interestingly, when wedge tombs come along, they're actually, for the most part, in different parts of the county than the passage tombs. So what might be going on socially there? Well, I don't have a slide to show you this, but interestingly, the same period, if we go over to southern England, the area around Stonehenge, so think of Stonehenge as this great ritual center, and when the earliest Beaker material comes into that area, it isn't right in the ritual core of Stonehenge, it's actually at some remove, and only after some time goes by do we then find later Beaker material incorporated into the great ritual center of Stonehenge. Might we have something similar going on in Sligo, with perhaps the passage tombs still being these great, and particularly the great cemeteries of Carrowmore and Carrowkeel, still being these kind of ritual power centers of the late Neolithic, that, at least if you look at the distribution of wedge tombs, seem to be, for the most part, avoided by whoever is building these wedge tombs in the Chalcolithic period. if we look at where beakers are found in Sligo, this pattern also seems to hold up, even though the evidence on the ground is a bit thin. Not a lot of beakers have been found in Sligo. So there are some in the Mortier wedge tomb that I've marked there. There are also some up in the much earlier Creevy Keel court tomb that I've marked there. Oh, I should say also another pattern that's found in the Stonehenge region in that earlier phase, when the beakers aren't in the old Stonehenge core, they are placed in much earlier long barrel mounds, like West Kennet is one. These are early Neolithic long barrows related, actually very closely related to monuments like Creevy Keel. And here we have the same pattern, that this much earlier monument is reused in beaker times, and we get beaker deposited in there as well. What else do we have? Well, those other two big red dots, we have one of those archer's wrist guards. It's a particular type, I'll show you in a minute, with 4 holes, which suggests that it's early. That's found there up north of Sligo town. And then out on Inishmurray, a distinctive barbed and tanged arrowhead, probable, this one's broken, but found out on the excavations on Inishmurray. Now again, the evidence very thin on the ground, but you can see where we do have beakers or beaker-related material like the wrist guard or the barbed and tanged arrowhead, it's not right in those old late Neolithic passage tomb cores. And in fact, the north bit of County Sligo seems to be more of a focus from this map. Okay, and I suppose this ties into, many of you will have heard, in terms of ancient DNA analysis, that there has been various ancient DNA analysis on many of the individuals in Irish passage tombs. And one of the conclusions of those studies is that many of the individuals buried in Irish passage tombs, right from the Boyne Valley right out to County Sligo, are part of a related elite that's being buried in these passage tombs. And in Newgrange, it made the headlines because there actually seemed to be an inbred elite as well. So what I'm suggesting is, does that late Neolithic kind of social power structure still hold sway in the late Neolithic? And is that why wedge tombs and this beaker-related material seemingly avoid these late Neolithic power centers? Okay. But then, as I mentioned, that scenario in England changes. Later beakers are incorporated into the Stonehenge Ritual Center. Do we have something similar happening here in Sligo? Well, one of the classic aspects of the Beaker phenomenon elsewhere outside of Ireland is you get these individual inhumations. So there on the right is showing you a classic one from Britain. So a crouched inhumation in a stone cyst with a beaker by the face. In Ireland, we don't get those, but later on, overlapping with late beakers, we start to get a new type of pottery, bowl tradition pottery, and I've got the dates there. So it doesn't appear until 2160, goes on for a little more than a century. And then when we start to get Irish bowl pottery, we do start to get single inhumations. They're showing you a woman from Keenog in County Meath. So crouched inhumation in a massive stone cyst with an upright Irish bowl by her face. So this is showing you a couple of things, this tradition of burying people as individuals with a vessel. And you can see that the Keenog bowl, although it's bowl shaped rather than beaker shaped, very much owes a lot of its decoration to beakers. They are kind of an Irish take on beakers. So it shows that this idea of individual burial does come into Ireland, but later. And now when we turn back to Sligo, what's interesting is where do we find these bowl burials in Sligo? Well, first, just to show you a few that are found, because there's a fair amount of these around Sligo. So that one on the right there at Brohar, just south of the south end of the Brickleave Mountains, a little natural knoll there was used as a cemetery mound. And there's various cyst graves and a pit grave. In this case, they're cremations and accompanied by bowls. I've just shown you an illustration of a couple of bowls there. At Stone Parks in Ballymote, over on the left, you have again a stone cyst. Early excavation, that's why the drawing is fairly crude. So a stone cyst crouched inhumation, and a bowl placed in front of her face. And you can see the radiocarbon date on her there. Oh, my slides are a bit out of order, but okay, we'll come back to the single burials. Another thing, I've mentioned various things that are associated with beakers. So I've mentioned the wrist guards of the archers, particular types of arrowheads. Another thing we get are these V perforated buttons. And they can be quite spectacular, like those Scottish ones down there at the bottom. They're called V perforated. If you look at the little black and white drawing from the Mound of the Hostages in Meath, you can see why, that little cross section of it there, you can see. So 2 holes drilled in from the bottom to create that V, and then it has a kind of a cone top, often made out of jet, as these are, this shiny black material, but sometimes made out of other materials as well. Well, interesting for our study, generally on the continent and in Britain, these V perforated buttons are contemporary with beakers. In Ireland, now the dating's not brilliant, but in Ireland, these V perforated buttons seem to be contemporary with these later Irish bowls. That is sometime between, right around a little before 2000 BC to a little after. So part of this later phase in Ireland. So where do we find them? So where do we find V perforated buttons? Where do we find some of these bowl burials in Sligo? Well, very interestingly, we start to find these things in and around passage tombs. So this Tren McMurta, which is a probable passage tomb located really right in the middle of the whole Carrow-Keele Keshcoran passage tomb complex, showing you a plan of it there on the right. And it has these later cyst burials inserted into it. You can see 2 stone cysts inserted into it. I've enlarged on one because in that one, you had 2 individuals in there, cremation of an adult, and then a crouched inhumation of a young child. And in front of that child was a pottery vessel, which is actually a bit anomalous, but it's classed as a bowl/vase. Irish vases developed out of bowls, and you can see that has a bit straighter sides than the bowls I was showing you before, but it's still a related type of pottery. It just tends to date a little. This is kind of transitional between bowls and vases and dates slightly later. And there you can see the radiocarbon date on the child, 2020 to 1751 BC. So the point is, here in this later phase, we're starting to get these new ways of burying people and new things incorporated right into the passage tombs. So another example, right inside the Carrow-Keele Cairn K passage tomb, set amongst the earlier Neolithic deposits, you get a bowl, and probably some of those burials in there are probably related to this bowl as well. But again, it's all a bit scrambled from the early excavations. Another one of the passage tombs at Carrow-Keele, Cairn O, again, another bowl found inside it, sitting on top of a pile of both cremated and inhumed bones. And then these archers' wrist guards that I talked about. Here's one from Carrow-Keele, now not in a tomb, but found in a bog. And in fact, in Ireland, most weapons and kind of weapon equipment, like what a wrist guard is, aren't buried with people. They're buried with people elsewhere. They're buried with people in Britain and on the continent. But here in Ireland, they seem to generally be deposited as ritual deposits in watery places. And this one fits exactly into that. It was found deposited in a bog, and that bog is in amongst the passage tombs at Carrow-Keele. And again, that form with just 2 holes as opposed to 4 holes, as best we can tell from the dating, is late and contemporary with the bowls, whereas the one I just showed you on a dot on the map from North County Sligo before was a 4-hole type, which seems to be earlier. And then those 2 reconstructions there are just showing you, so that one on the top is a 4-holed one, the one on the bottom is a 2-holed one, and how they might have been worn. Some people, as in that little color picture on the top, think they were on the inside of the wrist, but some of these later 2-holed ones are quite thick and might actually catch the bowstring. So the idea on that bottom reconstruction is it was more of a decorative piece sewn onto and displayed on the outside of kind of a leather cuff. that acted as the actual wrist guard. Okay, but the point here is that another item of this new persona of the warrior associated with Bold tradition pottery and deposited right in an earlier passage tomb cemetery. Going down into the lowlands of Carramore, again, early finds, so their context is not exact, but we do have bowls from within the cemetery. So there on the left is a bowl from Barnashrahi townland, either in one of the passage tombs or nearby Sis. The account is a bit unclear on that. And sherds from another probable bowl found in another one of the passage tombs at Carramore. And those V perforated buttons I showed you, so another aspect associated with beakers elsewhere, but seem to be associated with the later Irish bowls in Ireland. Down in the Carramore passage tomb group, down in tomb 49, you have a V perforated button. There's it shown there. And up on top of Knocknarea, you have one made out of jet, found adjacent to the massive Queen Maeve's cairn. So again, incorporated right into the heart of these earlier late Neolithic ritual centers. Okay, so there, admittedly, the evidence for the earlier phase of beakers is there's not a lot in Sligo, but what evidence there is does seem to suggest an avoidance of the late Neolithic cores. And then this later evidence, which is more numerous, does indicate incorporation within those cores. But before we leave this, we have to go back to Moytira, because there may well be a bit of a conflict, certainly a bit of a fly in the ointment for this interpretation here. Because they're zooming in on the Moytira wedge tomb where we had those early beakers, and not too far away at all is Barrow North, only in terms of I think it's about it's in terms of hundreds of meters. It's not that far, is a probable passage tomb. So, if you have this early avoidance, Moytira certainly seems to contradict this evidence. So I've got no explanation for that at this point, other than that the picture is perhaps not so completely clear-cut, and even at a scale as small as a county in Sligo, that you might have different things going on, so that even though there's a passage tomb there in the Moytira area, you have this early incursion of beakers, but in the kind of great concentrations at Carramore and Carrowkeel, you might have this more of the resistance and only a later incorporation. Okay. Moving on in time a little bit, as we move from the Chalcolithic into the early Bronze Age. Now, this isn't all exactly chronological, but it is roughly chronological. In Ireland, generally, technologically, the Chalcolithic turns into the early Bronze Age sometime around 2100, 2150 BC. That is when the invention of bronze occurs. So somebody figures out that if you alloy tin and copper, you get this much stronger and more useful metal, bronze. One of the very important aspects of beaker ideology that then seems to develop further as we move into the early Bronze Age is this greater emphasis on individual identity. I mentioned those single burials that we see with the Irish bowls, for instance. And that goes along possibly with an opening up of multiple paths that an individual might take in terms of pursuit of power and social status. Remember, the wedge tombs I suggested were perhaps built in this context of competition for social status. Because there's multiple burials in wedge tombs and the scale of them, I would think that that's probably different lineages perhaps, or different kind of segments of a tribe competing for power. But now I want to get down even to the more individual level in the early Bronze Age. And this is just showing you, this kind of a lead-in slide showing you some of the things that we'll talk about. But first, before we talk about these things, daggers, gold lunula, urn burials, etc., I want to take you all the way to the South Pacific. Very exotic looking people and a very interesting group of islands down there. And the reason we're going down there is to look at an anthropological model. Because often, and much of the research I do is social archaeology, trying to reconstruct how past societies were constructed. and you have to get your models from somewhere. And so one of the typical places that archaeologists interested in this kind of thing get their models is from looking at anthropologically known societies. So quite interestingly, so these are fairly small scale societies. You see in the little box down there, I say these are groups of people that number, and the tribes number from the hundreds up to the thousands, and maybe as much as 10,000. And they're what are called open societies, and that doesn't mean they're all free and easy. Quite the contrast. But what they mean by open societies is that that power is not held exclusively by one group. There are multiple paths to power, and there's a lot of instability and competition for power. So you have the chiefs, who are kind of secular administrative power. Then you have warriors who get achieved status. In other words, it depends on how good of a warrior you are to how much status you have. And then you have these inspirational shaman priests who are also generally achieved status. And all three of these, so the secular administrative power of the chief, the martial or warfare power of the warriors, and the spiritual power of the shaman priests are in competition with each other, and they're vying for power, and that makes these societies unstable. So the Marquesas are a classic example of one of these open societies and these three kind of routes or paths to power. But to be honest, this seems to be quite widespread in many human societies of various scales. And you don't need to think any further than if you just kind of think about what the emergence and development of the Irish state in the last couple centuries. You can absolutely see example of administrative power, martial power, and religious power, sometimes working together, sometimes at cross purposes. And that would be a very viable way of analyzing recent Irish history. So like I said, I think it seems to be maybe not universal, but it's certainly quite a common aspect of many human societies. Okay, so given that, if we envisage a similar scenario for Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age Sligo, is there evidence to support this kind of a model? Well, I mentioned daggers before, and certainly in Sligo and elsewhere affected by the Beaker Phenomenon and then later developments into the early Bronze Age, one of the clearest identities or statuses that we see emerge is that of the warrior. So martial power, and the classic weapons of these Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age warriors are daggers and bows and arrows. So here's just what we have in Sligo. So there's an early one at Ardnaglass, contemporary Old Tradition pottery, and then various other ones later on in the early Bronze Age, but all found in County Sligo. So the Irish practice, these daggers are all found deposited in watery places, whether it's next to rivers or in bogs. So this Irish practice of depositing weapons in watery places does make it harder to identify individual warriors. But the fact that we get the appearance of these daggers, the archer's wrist guards, metal axes are probably also used as axes a good amount of time. All this shows the importance of the rise of martial power at this time. And this identity of the warrior at this time. We also have in Sligo these spectacular golden Lunula, and so some of these have been published and written on in your Sligo volumes by Mary Cahill and others. They date, as best we can tell, to right around 2000 BC. They certainly seem to be, wearable symbols of power. What kind of power? They could be that secular administrative power. They could be ritual power. One case recently made very well by Mary Cahill is that their golden color and their boat-like shape suggests that they are symbolic of sunboats. The idea that the sun was carried in a boat is a widespread European and even further Eastern Mediterranean belief in the Bronze Age. So perhaps these are symbols. So they say they could be administrative powers of secular administrative power. They could be symbols of religious power. They could be worn by people who are combining both religious and secular power. Okay, I've got now these. I put these in just because they're fantastic reconstructions. We don't have any done like this for Ireland. So this is contemporary high status individuals over in England, early Bronze Age. So you might imagine, you know, if you're trying to imagine what some of these people look like that might have been wearing these Lunula, etc. in Sligo. Up top there's Bush Barrel Man, very famous, buried on a ridge overlooking Stonehenge. And you can see he's got one of the symbols of his power is a big gold diamond or lozenge-shaped plate on his chest. He also has quite a fancy dagger at his belt, so he has that symbol. So he's he's got a dagger at his belt. He's holding an axe. He's in his left hand, in his right hand, he's holding a mace, really a mace, a symbol of power. He's got a golden belt buckle as well. So really, Bush Barrel Man is a good example. And this were all found on, sorry, he's an inhumation under a barrel. And so all these things were found on and around him. And he's a good example of an individual probably wearing a combination of both secular and martial symbols of power. In the middle there, you have a woman from Manton Barrow. Now, it's hard to see what she's wearing, but she has various bits of high status jewelry on her. She's got earrings and a necklace. Also, quite interestingly, you can just see on her left-hand side there, hanging off her belt, is a little miniature dagger. And then the other man, the quite striking man on the right there, Upton Lovell, another inhumation under a barrel. He was found with metalworking tools, little anvils and things like that. So he was certainly a metal worker. And you have to remember that in many traditional societies, you know, the act of changing stone ore into metal, it was often seen as a magical property. So in this case, this man was buried with these very striking bone points, which they've reconstructed as a necklace, and then those boar tusks down by his waist. And these things were either worn by him as a necklace or perhaps sewn onto his clothing. So this very striking aspect has made the interpreter suggest maybe he was both a metal worker and a shaman, so that, you know, not unlike perhaps those inspirational shaman priests from the Marquesas. Okay, back to Sligo though, just show you those images to kind of make these people come alive a bit more. We have this fascinating burial at Carrigaines. So it's not only elite individuals that we start to see in the early Bronze Age, but we start to get you know, people further down the social scale that perhaps weren't so you know, wealthy or powerful, but still marked out as individuals in terms of the way they're buried in their grave goods. So at Carrigaines, we have a little cyst burial. So that's what it's showing you there, a stone cyst. Cremation contained in that urn, type of urn called a collared urn. Cremation of a 14 to 16-year-old youth, along with that bone toggle and some very burnt cowrie shells. So what's going on there? Well, the excavator, this has been interpreted as a young girl, 14 to 16-year-old girl. The cremated remains were too crushed and cremated to tell the sex for certain, but cowrie shells, as you can see there, are often used in traditional societies because of their appearance as symbols of femininity and fertility. So that's why we identify this one as probably being female. If I just show you the next slide though. Okay, that collared urn, okay, sorry if I go back, that's an early Bronze Age type of urn named after that distinctive collar at the top. So these are coming along even after bowls and vases. There's a development of pottery. Well, that collared urn, you can see from this distribution on the map, are very common over in Britain and not so common here in Ireland. And that map is actually even leaving out this Carrigaines one, but we could put a dot over there in Sligo. I've got on the left the fine spot over there. So that's quite interesting. It certainly seems to show some kind of a connection to Britain. That bone toggle is also interesting. If I go back to that bone toggle there, it's just showing you three different views of it. And it is burnt oh, sorry, those are different pieces of it. It's burnt and distorted. But that type of bone toggle is also relatively rare in Ireland, but common in Scottish burials. And that's quite interesting because the toggle is probably part of clothing. And clothing is one of the key ways that people express group affinity. So here you have, probably a young woman dying and being buried in Sligo in a British type of urn with possibly wearing clothes that identify her more with Scotland than with Sligo. Bearing all that in mind, take you even further afield over to Bavaria in southern Germany, because at Carrageen's we just have one individual cremated, so there's not a lot you can do in terms of analyzing the bone. But I want to show you this study, absolutely contemporary. See, this is southern Bavaria, Beaker early Bronze Age period, 2500 to 1700 in the local chronology. And what you're looking at here, they had 80 well-preserved skeletons from a whole group of nearby cemeteries in this one valley, a place called the Lech Valley. Now, just a real quick explanation of the science behind this. This is something called isotope analysis. And if you look at that graph in the center on the vertical axis, you can see those SR87 and SR86. That's just referring to strontium. Strontium is an element in the earth. And interestingly, we incorporate strontium into the tissues of our own body through the food that we eat. And strontium in different geologies has a different signature. So if you, for instance, grow up in Connemara with all the granites over there, you have a particular strontium signature different than somebody that grew up down in County Clare on the limestones. And then also what's quite interesting is as you're growing up, you're incorporating the strontium into the tissues of your body. But of course, the enamel on your teeth stops growing when you reach maturity. So you get that signature, that strontium signature of where you grew up in your body. You carry that around in your teeth for the rest of your life. And then if you die and are buried somewhere else that has a different strontium signature, we can see the contrast between the signature in your tooth enamel and the signature of where you end up buried. Similarly, along the horizontal axis, you can see they're looking at oxygen isotopes. Oxygen also varies, and we also incorporate that into our tissues. In the case of oxygen, we tend to incorporate it through our drinking water. And in Europe, the oxygen, the isotopes of oxygen vary basically in a west-east cline. And that has something to do with the weather patterns as they sweep in across the Atlantic and then across the European continent. Okay, so basically, all I'm trying to tell you, though, is that there are these strontium signatures and oxygen signatures preserved in our tooth enamel that can tell us, upon analysis, where we grew up. And if you look then in that left-hand graph, that is looking at all the men and children from the cemeteries in this valley. And that little box at the bottom of the graph between the dashed lines is showing you the local strontium oxygen signature of the Lech Valley. And you can see that nearly all of those men and children, so men are blue, children are yellow, are within that little box. You don't have to worry about triangles and circles, just one is Bell Beaker and one is early Bronze Age, but they're all, nearly all local. Then if you look over to that right-hand graph, that's all the women from these cemeteries. Completely different pattern there. Only a portion of those women are within that box, so only a portion grew up in the Lech Valley, and the majority actually grew up outside the Lech Valley and only moved into the Lech Valley and eventually were buried there later in life. So that gives us a lot of detail about what's going on in these societies, and that, as I've said in the bottom left there, is what anthropologists would refer to as patrilocality and female exogamy. And what that means is at marriage, the pattern is for the women to move away from their home and move to their husband's village, their husband's location, in this case, into the Lech Valley. Okay, bearing that in mind, if we go back to Sligo and we go back to Carrageen's again, taken together, I would suggest that the evidence from Carrageen's suggests the death and burial of a non-local girl, really on the cusp of womanhood. So it's quite possible, I would say, that she is a Scottish bride who has come over here to Sligo and quite tragically died quite soon after she arrives in her new home. So I've left her out of focus there, but it starts to bring some of these people a bit more into focus, and the stories they might have had to tell a bit more into focus. We have other examples from Sligo that are quite fascinating, but to give you a bit more context on them, again, back to the Lech Valley in Bavaria, because the preservation there was so good that they could do a lot of DNA studies as well. So what are you looking at here? Again, I don't want to dwell on this because this is Bavaria, not Sligo, but what you're looking at down the left-hand side are haplogroups. So those are just groups of genes that identify, when you find them in two different people, it just identifies that they're closely related people. Across the top there, you just have the different cemeteries. So those are all the Lech Valley cemetery sites. And if I can just draw your attention to a couple, and then if you look down, the various numbers there are grave numbers. So if you look down in that first column underneath it where it says I can't pronounce German, but Augsburg Hugo Eckener Straub site, you see there is burial number 180 there, and it's in that haplogroup. There's skeleton 1 is a man, and also skeleton 2. So it's a burial with 2 adult male skeletons in it, and they're both in the same haplogroup. They're both closely related individuals. Then if we go up that to the top row, and you look at those number 14, 15 in orange under Werhingen Hochfield, you see there another burial, this case burial number 14, 15, again, 2 individuals in it. One was an adult woman and one was a child, and again, both from the same haplogroup. So they're, again, 2 closely related individuals buried together. So what the German archaeologists found in these cemeteries with the DNA analysis is they had cases of close relatives buried together. They had also close relatives buried in multiple graves, and they had close relatives buried in neighboring graves. And I should say, and this is all, these haplogroups are all through the maternal lineage. This analysis didn't look at the paternal, the male lineage, so it's not complete. But the overall interpretation in these societies in the Lech Valley are societies where maternal lineage was a very significant form of social structuring that determined burial patterns, and so presumably was important in the relationships of living people as well. Okay, so bearing that in mind, going back to Sligo again, and another site that many of you may well be familiar with, a recent excavation, and was published in one of the Sligo volumes. Caltra, just south of Sligo town, excavations ahead of the Inner Relief Road. There's the publications, Ed Danaher, Alison Sheridan, and Lenan there. And so you can see there some of their excavations of these cremation pits. And quite fascinatingly, in 2 of the cremation pits, they found what seemed to be beads from the same necklace. So there, cremation 1, adult woman, 40 to 50 years old, died about sometime between 1890 to 1680 BC. She had the majority of beads, but a nearby cremation, cremation 2, another 40 to 50-year-old, died a bit later, had 4 of the beads. And the interpretation that the excavators felt was that the first woman was cremated with that, wearing that necklace. And then after the cremation, some of those beads were taken out and saved from the cremation as held as an heirloom and not buried again until that second woman, until the second woman died. So that, again, is quite fascinating. I take you to this slide because, you know, what's that showing us? Well, it's showing us the importance, it's certainly showing us grief, but it's also showing us the importance of that maternal lineage in terms of identity, because those 2 individuals at Caltra are quite possibly mother and daughter, or grandmother and granddaughter, depending on where they land in that date range. But then one final thing about Caltra also, and there's looking at the necklace reconstructed, is that type of necklace is more common in Britain than in Ireland. So importance of maternal lineage, and again, another maternal lineage that may well be stretching across the Irish Sea and over to Britain. similar to what I suggested for Caltra. Okay, that then brings us to another site, another Sligo site, this one down in South Sligo, the Moylock Burial. Martin Timoney, who's here tonight, has published extensively on this recently. So you get a much more detailed view of it there. But what I want to show you, so it's another cyst burial, cremation, there's the date, buried with a weapon. So seems to be a warrior's grave. There's a bit of debate about whether that's a dagger or a halberd, but the weight of evidence does suggest a halberd, and I think that's the likely interpretation. So a little bit, what are halberds for those of you that are unfamiliar with them? There's one from Mayo on a reconstructed wooden haft, and a recent find from Wales, and then another reconstruction. They're these dagger-like blades, but they're mounted at right angles on top of a long handle. Now, there's been some confusion about the thickness of the handles, but the most likely is that a reconstruction on the right, which would make an effective weapon with a strong, thick handle like a pickaxe, and then the blade mounted at the top of it. Okay, so bear that in mind. We'll come back to these full-scale halberds in a minute, but what I want to also show you, if we go to England again, weapons and distinctive weapons like halberds seem to have quite possibly been used to be symbolic of particular regions or ethnic groups. Why do I say that? Well, if you look at that top left, the Wilsford G8, that is a little miniaturized pendant of a type of halberd, a Unetici type halberd, and the Unetici is just a early Bronze Age culture in Central Europe. But that was buried on a woman right next to Bush Burial Man on that same ridge overlooking Stonehenge. So there she is buried in southern England, but with a little replica miniaturized Central European halberd. And similar down there at Prosciut in Wiltshire, another woman buried with another miniaturized Unetici type halberd. Then if you look over at the right though, Wilsford again. So that's also right next to Bush Burial Man. And here's another woman, another high status woman buried on that ridge, but she doesn't have a halberd pendant. Instead, she has a little pendant representing a type of battle axe that for the most part, the full-sized ones come from Ireland and Northern Britain. So what we're possibly looking at here are women that have married in from either Central Europe on the one hand or Ireland and Northern Britain to the other, elite marriages down into the southern England. So my point here is that these weapons might actually be regional or ethnic signals, okay? And this idea has been taken up and really put forward a great deal by Stuart Needham, who's in the British Museum. And Stuart has produced even this map that you can see on the right here, where he's suggesting, now this is just a hypothesis, and to be honest, it's a hypothesis that needs to be tested a lot before it's accepted, because there's other possible explanations too. But what he's suggesting here is that all those blue zones in Ireland are areas where you have a lot of Beaker influence, and contrasting with that, the red zone that he has there are where you get halberds. And what he's suggesting are possibly two different ethnic / cultural groups. And interestingly for Sligo, you can see that most of Sligo then falls in that blue Beaker zone, but then West Sligo is out in the halberd zone, and Moylock, which I just showed you, would be on one side of that boundary, and then the Moytira Wedgeton, which is with its beakers, would be on the other side. So we may well have, according to Needham's model, some kind of a cultural / ethnic boundary in County Sligo in the early Bronze Age. Certainly an interesting model and something worth testing in the future. So that reconstruction, again, just trying to show you more people there. That's a very high status chiefly burial from Germany, but you can see him holding his halberd there. So that's what they might have looked like in life. Okay, I see I'm getting on towards the hour, so I won't tarry on these sites. The last site I want to show you in Sligo is out in West Sligo, a place called Baliskine, where there seems to be a concentration of early Bronze Age material. There is the excavated barrow in the middle there that I'll focus on, but just to the west of that, you can see there's a couple other cysts. So those are probably early Bronze Age burials. There's a fluctifia, that's probably Bronze Age. Just out of the picture to the west, off to the right there, there is excavations that probably a habitation area. There are some pits and other artifact spreads and some dates. I think, yeah, the dates were 1800 to 1700 BC, so early Bronze Age dates. So a fair amount of early Bronze Age activity out in this little area in West Sligo. But if we zoom in on that barrow that was excavated ahead of road widening, that's what it looks like. Not a hugely dramatic barrow, showing you a plan view over on the right and then in section there, but various phases to it. If you'll notice in the section there, high up in the section, there's a cyst burial and there's another pit burial. Both of those were cremations, but the primary deposit at Baliskine, right in the center of the mound and down on the old ground surface, was what's marked there as an ox burial. So that's the first thing that goes in there. And here's just showing you a few pictures in the excavation report. So there's that cyst, adult cremation, not found with anything diagnostic, another cremation in a pit, found with a little bit of pottery, hard to identify, but probably early Bronze Age. But down at the primary deposit, that's what I want to focus on. And again, found probably with early Bronze Age urns. So we don't have any radiocarbon dates, but all the evidence points to that all phases of this mound are early Bronze Age. Okay, but there's the excavator's description of that primary deposit at the center of the mound. A quantity of very broken fragments of decalcified bone, probably all ox. The only identifiable pieces were parts of ox vertebra, about 36 teeth of ox, and all were adult bones and teeth. Now for ox, in a modern parlance, we would read bovine. In other words, that doesn't mean that that was necessarily ox in the steer castrated sense of an ox. It is either a cow or a bull. It's a bovine. So that's quite interesting, because the central and primary position of that, what seems to be head and neck burial of a bovine, suggests certainly a ritual deposit and quite possibly something commemorating a feasting event. If an entire bovine was slaughtered and eaten, there's different ways of estimating how many people might be fed, but we probably imagine a crowd of several hundred at some type of a ceremony. Again, this isn't unique. Here's a couple examples from Britain, again, contemporary with that, showing you massive feasting examples. Earthling burrow up on the upper right there. Adult man buried with a beaker, flint dagger, some of those V perforated buttons, archer's wrist guard that I talked about, and all covering that barrow. Phenomenal, nearly 200 cow skulls, along with various other bits of cattle bones as well. A Gayhurst burial there, another adult man buried, same period, remains of at least 300 cattle deposited in the ditch around it. Now, analysis of these bones suggests that, absolutely feasting results, but maybe multiple feasts, in this case, in different parts of the surrounding region, and then the heads or the skulls or other bits just brought to the barrow to commemorate all those disparate feasting events. Well, at Baliskine, that's not what we have. In other words, here we don't, not only these massive events compared to Baliskine, but the cattle remains are after the burial. At Baliskine, the cattle remains are the first thing, and the burials come after it. So that's a bit different. But I would suggest that, because we see other early Bronze Age burials in the area, that maybe the feasting at Baliskine is related to a nearby burial, or maybe it commemorated some non-funerary event. And later, because of the reputation of that event, that feast that was commemorated, then that made the mound appropriate to put those later burials in. And that brings us back around kind of full circle to the Marquesas, because what I'm suggesting for Baliskine in terms of those competing paths to power is that at Baliskine we might be getting the remains, the archaeological remains of a ceremony overseen by somebody like those shaman priests of the Marquesas. And there is showing you a feast in the Marquesas. This is slightly later in the image that I showed you before, so they've been Christianized by the time that photo was taken. They're wearing all their Christian white feasting outfits. And in the Marquesas, feasts are held for various things. Yes, they're held for funerals, but they also hold them for victorious battles, for good harvests, for weddings, for elite births, for chiefly heirs. But the important point is that these, and I think the photo shows it, is that all these types of feasts are ideal arenas for vying for and building social status. In other words, they're opportunities to host at a feast. They're opportunities to officiate, as a priest, to speak the will of the gods. There are offerings for many people to participate. And so all these things we might envisage for early Bronze Age societies in Sligo too. And I think at Baliskine, what we might have is, the traces of one of these ceremonies, where people might have been competing for power, whether it's between, shamans and secular power and warriors, etc. Okay, so that really brings me to the end. I just quickly flipped through the last 4 slides just to summarize and remind you of kind of what we went through this evening. So beginning then, I was talking about Sligo incorporated into these wide-ranging beaker exchange networks quite early on, but the old late Neolithic power structures and power centers in terms of where the passage tomb cemeteries are may have initially resisted those new influences. But as time goes on, when we get into the bowl traditions, a few centuries later, not only do we start to see individuals come out of the burial record as individuals, as that woman there on the left, but we also start to see these bowl burials and their associated artifacts incorporated right into the old Neolithic passage tombs. And we start to get, as I say, in the early Bronze Age, these both individuals and social relationships come into view. And I think both Carrageen's and Caltra are quite evocative examples of that. And then my final slide, suggesting that early Bronze Age Sligo was probably at this time home to small-scale societies where power was perhaps more fluid than it was in the Neolithic, and open to competition, possibly from using, again, that Marquesas model, these 3 different kind of avenues to power that are represented there. So that really brings me to the end. I think I'm just about, yeah, oh God, I've gone over a bit, so I apologize for that. But that does bring me to the end, and absolutely, time for questions if anybody has any questions or comments.